Right now, in 2026, one of the most legendary names in hip-hop history is being compared to the most feared and controversial figure the rap game has ever seen. And the person making that comparison is family. Ray J just went on the internet and publicly asked his own cousin, Snoop Dogg, to prove that he hasn't become the new Suge Knight. Let that sink in for a second. Not a rival, not a blogger, not some random person with a grudge. His own blood. And the accusations Ray J is passing along are not small. We are talking about royalties. We are talking about masters. We are talking about artists from the LBC, from Carson, from Compton, all the way up to Santa Clarita, saying they haven't seen a dime. This is not just drama. This is the kind of story that could permanently reshape how the world sees Snoop Dogg's legacy. And before we go any further, be sure to leave a like and subscribe because the people this video is about are not going to want you watching it. This is the death row conversation that hip-hop has been avoiding. And we are not avoiding it today. Let's set the stage. Because before you can understand why Ray J's video hit the way it did, you need to understand the weight of what he was actually saying. Death Row Records. If you know hip-hop, you know what those three words mean. In the early 1990s, Death Row was not just a record label. It was a movement. It was a cultural earthquake. It launched Snoop Dogg. It launched Dr. Dre's solo career. It gave Tupac Shakur some of the most important music of his life. For a window of time in the mid-1990s, Death Row Records was the most powerful, the most dominant, and honestly the most feared force in the entire music industry. And at the center of all of it was one man, Suge Knight. Now for those who don't know the full story, Suge Knight was not just an executive. He was a force of intimidation wrapped in a business suit. Stories have circulated for decades about artists being pressured, contracts being manipulated, and money disappearing into a machine that artists could never quite see inside of. Dr. Dre left the label, and then the lawsuit started, and then the federal investigation started, and then the conviction started. Death Row Records collapsed under the weight of its own power. The label filed for bankruptcy. Suge Knight eventually ended up behind bars. And for years, Death Row existed as a cautionary tale. A ghost of what hip-hop greatness could become when power and money and ego run completely unchecked. Now here's where the story takes a sharp turn. In February of 2022, Snoop Dogg purchased Death Row Records. And when he made that announcement, the reaction from hip-hop fans was almost universal. People were excited. People were emotional. Because the idea of Snoop Dogg, one of the artists who built Death Row's legacy, taking ownership of the very label that launched him felt like justice. It felt like healing. It felt like the culture was finally correcting one of its most painful chapters. Snoop himself talked about it like he was on a mission. He said he wanted to make Death Row into a boutique label. He talked about bringing back the legacy the right way. He positioned himself as the man who was going to give Death Row a second life rooted in respect, in art, and in community. The West Coast celebrated. And it seemed like one of hip-hop's most troubled stories was finally getting a redemption arc. But now, we are in 2026, and the narrative has shifted, because Ray J just posted a video that stopped the internet cold. And in that video, he looked directly into the camera and asked his cousin Snoop Dogg to tell the world that he has not become the new Suge Knight. And here's where things get interesting. Ray J didn't come out swinging. He didn't come to embarrass Snoop. He framed his message as a cry from the family. He said he's hearing from Dash. He's hearing from Julian. He's hearing from at least 20 other people. And what they are telling him is deeply troubling. They are saying that since Snoop took over Death Row, the royalties haven't been distributed. They are saying artists aren't being treated fairly. They are saying that the man who was supposed to be the savior of Death Row might be running the same playbook as the man who destroyed it the first time. And Ray J ended that video with 5 words that cut right through everything. Make it make sense, Snoop. That is not just a message between cousins. That is a public challenge. That is a demand for accountability. And the internet heard every single word of it. Now let's go deeper. Because there are multiple layers to this situation. And every single layer is important. Let's start with the names Ray J specifically mentioned. He said he talked to Dash. He said he talked to Julian. He said there are 20 other people echoing the same thing. Now Dash in this context is almost certainly Daz Dillinger. And for those who don't know, Daz Dillinger is not a background character in this story. He is a foundational figure in the Death Row legacy. Daz was part of the Dog Pound alongside Corrupt. He was producing and writing records during Death Row's peak era. He has direct connections to that catalog. And Daz did not stay quiet. Daz Dillinger has been publicly vocal about his frustrations since Snoop took over the label. He came out and accused Snoop of trying to take control of music rights and trademarks connected to death row artists. And Daz made it very clear what he actually wants. He said it plainly. He said he doesn't want the money. He wants the rights. Because when you get the rights, the money follows naturally. That is a critical distinction. Because an artist asking for money can be dismissed. An artist asking for the rights to their own creative work, that is a completely different conversation. That is about ownership. That is about legacy. That is about whether the artists who built Death Row Records will ever truly have control over what they created. And here's where things get even more complicated. Because Daz Dillinger wasn't the only one speaking out before Ray J ever posted his video. There was another situation that hit different. Nate Dogg passed away in 2011. He was one of the most beloved figures in West Coast hip-hop. His contributions to the sound of that era are absolutely undeniable. And now, his son came forward. Nate Dogg's son came out and made a claim that shook people. He said that Snoop Dogg went to his grandmother's house, got permission from her, and left with his father's masters. Let that image sit with you for a second. Going to an elderly woman's home, getting access to her late son's recordings, and walking out with them. Now, we are not saying that was illegal. We are not claiming to know every detail of that arrangement. But the optics of that situation, the way it looks from the outside, is exactly the kind of thing that feeds a narrative. And the narrative building around Snoop Dogg and Death Row right now is one he cannot afford to ignore. Now let's talk about what Snoop actually said when Daz first came at him publicly. Because Snoop's response told us a lot. He did not sit down and address the royalty claims. He did not pull out receipts. He did not say, here's what I've actually paid out. Here's what I've distributed. Here are the numbers. He went online and he called Daz broke. He said Daz was hating. He said, you ain't got nothing to do but hate on me. He said he was going to get him up business-wise. Now look, in hip-hop, that kind of clapback energy is familiar. When you're being attacked, you punch back. Nobody is confused about that. But there is a specific problem with responding to financial accusations by calling someone broke. Because calling someone broke is not a rebuttal. It is a deflection. If artists are saying they haven't been paid, the answer to that is not, you're broke. The answer to that is showing the receipts. And the fact that Snoop chose ridicule over transparency. That is exactly the kind of response that makes people wonder what is actually going on behind the scenes. And here's what we really need to be honest about. The Suge Knight comparison is not something that gets made lightly. In hip-hop circles, comparing someone to Suge Knight is not a compliment. It is not a metaphor. It is not a casual dig. It is one of the heaviest, most loaded comparisons you can make about a person's character and business conduct. Suge Knight's name is synonymous with exploitation, with intimidation, with artists being locked into situations that benefited the label at the expense of the creators. The stories that came out about Death Row's original era are legendary for all the wrong reasons. Artists signing contracts they didn't fully understand, royalties being withheld, creative control being stripped away. And the people most vulnerable to all of it were the artists who came from nothing and trusted the system that gave them their first real shot. Now, here is the comparison that should make every hip-hop fan stop and think. Snoop Dogg was one of those artists. He was one of the people who came up through Death Row. He knows better than almost anyone alive what it felt like to be on the other side of that equation. He was there. He lived it. He escaped it. He built an independent empire after leaving Death Row. So when people say Snoop is now running the same kind of operation, when people who were at his side during that era are the ones making these claims, the question has to be asked, how does a man who experienced exploitation become the person others are accusing of doing the same thing? Now let's talk about Ray J's role in this. Because some people online immediately questioned why Ray J was the one making this public. And that is a fair thing to examine. Ray J is not a Death Row artist. He is not someone with a direct financial stake in the label's catalog. But Ray J is family. And in the video he posted, he made that very clear. He said these are his blood relatives. He said he loves Snoop. He said he does not want to believe what he is hearing. And the reason that matters is because it changes the nature of the accusation. This is not a business rival talking. This is not someone with a vendetta. This is a family member who is publicly pleading with his cousin to come out and deny the allegations because the alternative is too painful to sit with. Ray J essentially said, I'm giving you a chance to clear your name, and I need you to take it. Because if you don't, then what does that tell us? Let's also look at the pattern here. Because this is not the first time an artist has spoken out about business disputes connected to a major hip-hop label. And this is not the first time a powerful figure in the industry has been accused of controlling a catalog at the expense of the original creators. This pattern runs through hip-hop history like a thread. We saw it with artists on major labels in the 1990s who signed away their masters and spent decades trying to get them back. We saw it with artists who discovered that the money they thought they were earning was being absorbed by advances, by recoupment clauses, by fees that seemed to multiply every time they looked at a statement. We saw it with independent labels that started as liberation from the corporate machine and eventually became a different kind of trap. And now we may be watching it unfold again. At the very label that was supposed to represent a new beginning. At the very label that Snoop Dogg promised to restore with dignity and fairness. If the accusations being made by Daz, by Julian, by Nate Dogg's son, and by the 20-plus people Ray J is hearing from turn out to be accurate, then this is not just a personal drama. This is a systemic failure. This is history repeating itself on the exact stage where it played out the first time. And let's be real about the business of Death Row in 2022 and beyond. When Snoop acquired the label, he moved quickly. He made announcements about plans to turn Death Row into an NFT label. He announced that Death Row would become the first major NFT label in the music industry. He talked about giving artists a new kind of ownership through technology. That was the pitch. That was the vision. And on the surface, it sounded forward-thinking. It sounded like Snoop was trying to use new tools to solve old problems. But here is the question that has to be asked. If the vision was really about artist ownership and artist empowerment, why are artists connected to Death Row saying they still haven't seen their royalties? Why are the people whose music lives inside that catalog saying they feel frozen out? Why is Daz Dillinger saying he just wants the rights to his own work? That is not a technology problem. That is not an NFT problem. That is a fundamental question about who Death Row Records actually serves. Now let's talk about legacy, because this is really what is at the core of everything Ray J said. Snoop Dogg has spent the last decade plus building a brand that goes far beyond music. He became a cultural icon. He became a Super Bowl halftime performer. He became someone that the mainstream embraced in a way that very few hip-hop artists of his generation ever achieved. He lit the Olympic torch. He did cooking shows. He became a meme. He became someone that grandparents and college students alike had an opinion about. And a huge part of that crossover appeal was built on his authenticity, his connection to the West Coast, his reputation as someone who never forgot where he came from, his loyalty to his people. That reputation is priceless, and it is exactly what is now being called into question. Because if the narrative that is forming takes hold, if the perception becomes that Snoop Dogg bought the label that shaped him and then ran the same exploitation playbook on the same community that built him, that is a legacy-destroying story. That is not something you walk back with a tweet. That is not something you fix with a feature on someone's album. That requires real accountability, real transparency, real receipts. And here's where things get really interesting. The people speaking up are not outsiders. They are insiders. Daz Dillinger was in the studio during the peak Death Row years. Julian Covington's name has been in these conversations. Nate Dogg's son is speaking about his father's legacy. These are not people who have nothing to do with Death Row. These are people who are fundamentally part of what Death Row is. And when the people who helped create something say they have been cut off from it, that is not a rumor. That is a testimony. That deserves a serious response. Not a dismissal. Not a social media clap back about who is and isn't broke. A real, substantive, public accounting of what has been paid, what has been distributed, and what the plan is for the artists whose work makes up that catalog. Now let's talk about what the internet is actually saying. Because the public reaction to Ray J's video was not uniform. Some people immediately sided with Snoop. They said Ray J was out of pocket. They said this is family business that should have stayed private. They said airing out your cousin online is a violation of loyalty codes that run deep in that community. And there is something to that perspective. Family disputes in public spaces can get messy fast. And once a narrative gets loose on the internet, it is almost impossible to control. But here is the counter to that argument. The reason Ray J went public is because private conversations apparently were not working. He said he talked to people. He said those people talked to Snoop. And the situation did not change. So when you've exhausted private channels and the problem persists, what do? Some people would say you stay quiet and let it work itself out. Others would say you bring the light to it. Because sunlight has always been one of the most powerful forces in holding powerful people accountable. Let's also put this in the context of the broader conversation about ownership in hip-hop, because this is a moment that connects to something much larger. The fight for masters and royalties is one of the defining battles of this generation of the music industry. We saw it with Taylor Swift and her masters dispute. That went mainstream in a way that changed how millions of people think about who actually owns music. We saw it with countless R&B and hip-hop artists who built their careers and then discovered that the catalog they built belongs to someone else. The conversation about ownership has never been louder. And now that conversation is landing right at the feet of Snoop Dogg and Death Row, an artist who used to be on the wrong side of that equation. An artist who now sits in the seat of power at the label where that wrong was originally done to him. The symmetry of that situation is almost impossible to ignore. And whether Snoop is actually in the wrong, or whether this is a misunderstanding that has been blown up online, the fact that the conversation is happening at this level, with these names attached, in this cultural moment, means it is not going away quietly. And let's be direct about one more thing. Snoop Dogg has not issued a detailed response. He has not sat down and addressed the specific allegations about royalties. He has not acknowledged Ray J's video in any comprehensive way. And in 2026, in the age of social media, where artists respond to the smallest slights within hours, silence on something this significant is itself a statement. Not necessarily a statement of guilt, but a statement that needs to be filled with something real. Because the longer the silence continues, the more room there is for the narrative to grow. And the narrative that is growing right now is one that Snoop built his entire post-Death Row career trying to distance himself from. The comparison to Suge Knight. The idea that power, when concentrated in one person's hands, tends to serve that one person above everyone else. Hip-hop fans have seen this movie before, and they know how it ends. The only question is whether Snoop Dogg will step up and rewrite this particular script. Now here is something that deserves real attention. When Snoop bought Death Row, there was a specific emotional weight to that moment. It wasn't just a business transaction. It was symbolic. It was a member of the original Death Row family reclaiming what had been taken. And the hip-hop community responded to that symbolism powerfully. People who hadn't thought about Death Row in years suddenly felt something. Because the idea of a former artist taking back the keys to his own house, that is a story hip-hop has been hungry for. And Snoop leaned into that story. He talked about it in interviews. He framed himself as the one who was going to make Death Row right. The one who was going to give artists the experience they deserved the first time around. So when the artists connected to that label start saying the reality does not match the promise, it lands harder than a regular business dispute. It lands as a broken promise. And in communities built on trust and loyalty, a broken promise carries more weight than a lawsuit. Let's also examine the business structure for a moment. When Snoop acquired Death Row from MNRK Music Group, the terms of that acquisition were not made fully public. What exactly was included in the purchase? Which catalogs? Which master recordings? Which publishing rights? Which artist agreements? These are questions that matter enormously, because how you structure the acquisition of a catalog determines who has the legal claim to what. And if the acquisition was structured in a way that consolidated control at the top without establishing clear pathways for royalty distribution back to the original artists, then what looks like exploitation from the outside might have a legal architecture behind it. That does not make it right. But it changes the conversation from, is Snoop a villain, to, is this a systemic failure of how music ownership works in America? Both conversations are important. Both deserve to be had. But only one of them is getting the spotlight right now. And the one getting the spotlight is the one that has Snoop's name on it. Let's bring it back to what Ray J actually said. Because buried inside the frustration and the pleading and the cousin-to-cousin language, there was a very specific thing Ray J asked for. He did not ask for drama. He did not ask for a public apology. He said, "Can you please tell everybody that I'm tripping?" That is an invitation. That is an opening. Ray J literally said, "Come out. Address this, prove that none of this is true, and we can all move forward." That is not an attack. That is someone trying to save a relationship while also standing by the people making the complaints. And the fact that Ray J had to go that public to try to get a response. The fact that the video had to go viral before any of this got real attention says something about how normal private accountability attempts had been going. Because Ray J is not somebody who just woke up one day and decided to put his cousin on blast for no reason. He said he spoke to Daz. He said he spoke to Julian. He said 20+ people are in his ear. He clearly sat with this before going on camera. And when he did go on camera, he did it with love. He ended the video saying, "Sincerely, Ray J. That is not a hit piece. That is a letter. A very public, very painful letter from one family member to another, asking for the one thing that could end all of this. The truth. So where does this go from here? And what does it mean for everyone involved?" Let's start with the most immediate question. Snoop Dogg's reputation is at a pivotal point. He has spent years building something that transcends hip-hop. The mainstream America version of Snoop Dogg is beloved in a way that very few artists ever achieve. But that mainstream version of Snoop is built on a foundation that starts in the LBC. It starts in those early death row years. It starts with the community and the culture that created him. If the people who are the living embodiment of that foundation are saying they have been let down, that contradiction is not something you can just paper over with celebrity appearances and brand partnerships. The question of who Snoop Dogg actually is as a business partner and label executive is now a public question. And it is going to stay a public question until it gets a public answer. Now here is the larger pattern this fits into. The conversation about artists' rights and catalog ownership is at an all-time high. Streaming has changed everything. Royalties work differently now. Catalogs are worth more than they have ever been worth because of the streaming economy. Death Row's catalog in particular is exceptionally valuable. These are not legacy recordings that only old heads remember. These are records that are being sampled, being streamed, being featured in films and television shows constantly. This catalog generates real money. Right now, in 2026. Which means the stakes for every single artist whose work lives inside that catalog are extremely high. And if those artists are saying the money is not coming back to them in a way that reflects their contribution, that is a story that is going to attract attention far beyond just hip-hop commentary channels. That is the kind of story that attracts journalists. That attracts lawyers. That attracts the attention of people who spend their professional lives examining exactly these kinds of arrangements. Now what happens competitively? This kind of controversy creates distance. Artists who might have wanted to align with Death Row under Snoop start to reconsider. Because nobody wants to sign with a label that has a credibility problem around fair treatment and royalty distribution. The Death Row brand is powerful, but the Death Row brand's power comes entirely from what it represents. And right now, what it represents is being actively contested. If Snoop addresses this head-on, if he comes out with transparency and accountability, there is absolutely a path through this. Hip-hop has seen artists and executives recover from controversies far more severe than this. But the window for that kind of proactive response has a time limit. The longer this goes without a real answer, the more the narrative hardens. And if this narrative hardens, the comparison to Suge Knight stops being a question and starts being a conclusion that people accept as fact. And for someone who has built what Snoop has built, who has survived what Snoop has survived, who has achieved what Snoop has achieved, to have that be the final chapter of his Death Row story would be one of the most tragic reversals in hip-hop history, because the potential was there. The symbolism was there. The community was ready to celebrate him for doing it right. And if it turns out he didn't do it right, the disappointment will hit harder than any diss track ever could. This situation also raises a question that hip-hop as a whole needs to sit with. What does it mean when one of our own achieves the power to control the legacy of the culture, and the culture has to ask whether he is using that power responsibly? That is not just a question about Snoop Dogg. That is a question about what success and power mean in this industry, and whether the lessons of the past actually change anything, or whether the same patterns just repeat with different names at the top. And so now with all of that said, let me know what you think. Do you think Ray J was right to go public with this? Or should he have kept this inside the family? Do you believe the artists who are saying they haven't been paid properly? Or do you think this is a situation where the full story hasn't come out yet? And most importantly, do you think Snoop Dogg is running Death Row in a way that honors the legacy? Or does the Suge Knight comparison have merit? Because those questions matter. They matter for the artists. They matter for the culture. and they matter for what kind of precedent gets set every time someone from the community gains the power to control what the community built. This is a conversation that is not finished, not even close. So drop your thoughts in the comments. I genuinely want to know where you stand on this. If you made it this far in the video, be sure to leave a like and subscribe. It honestly helps more than you know, and it keeps this kind of content coming. Thank you for being here. Thank you for caring about these conversations enough to watch them through to the end. You deserve to know this stuff. And in the meantime, if you want to see how another West Coast legend is navigating the complicated intersection of legacy, power, and loyalty in today's hip-hop landscape, you are not going to want to miss the next one. Check out the suggested video.